There are different sorts of treachery, but betrayal is betrayal wherever you find it, is one of my favorite lines in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, the book that we're going to use as a key to understand Worm. Betrayal is a breach of trust, so in order to understand what betrayal is, we first need to understand what trust is. Worm is a thesis. That is my thesis, that Worm is an argument where each arc builds upon the philosophical points that were made in previous arcs. In this essay, we're going to talk about everything that leads up to Leviathan, what kind of argument this arc makes, and how it sets up the groundwork for the following philosophical points. So if you don't know who Leviathan is, spoilers. Everyone else is relatively safe. Now, if this were a normal novel, it would make one philosophical argument at a time. Instead, this arc is going to set up 4 or 5 different points simultaneously. The first is about trauma. Taylor has already given us some insight into one way of dealing with trauma. With the Undersiders, we are going to see 4 more different approaches, their advantages and disadvantages. I heard a long time ago that Winnie the Pooh was written with the intention of giving kids a way to talk about their moods. If they're feeling depressed but don't know the D word yet, Winnie gives them the option to say, "I feel like Eeyore today." Similarly, each one of the Undersiders personifies a single response to trauma, whether it's being smarter than anyone else like Lisa, hiding any weakness like Brian, a detachment from one's own feelings like Alec, or just being indiscriminately hostile like Rachel. Taylor's response is slightly more complicated, but if we had to summarize, it would be to try really, really hard at every single thing. Aside from Taylor, the Undersiders are unrealistically singular in their coping mechanisms. In reality, a person recovering from trauma uses a mix of these approaches. That is not a negative critique. The singularity of the characters makes them easier to examine and learn from. And after reading about them, you can recognize these coping mechanisms in yourself. Furthermore, we are going to start seeing the 2 ways in which the characters recreate their own trauma. 1, by inflicting a similar trauma on others, and 2, by putting themselves in situations where their worst fears manifest. The argument Worm makes about trauma is that the things that we repress aren't hidden in some deep dark cavity inside of our souls. They manifest in our actions and thought processes every single day, and are probably pretty visible to the people around us. The next point is trust. What actually is it? Why do we need it, and how do we gain it? Trust is one of the answers to the most important question that Worm asks. How do we get people to cooperate? Trust is one way to get people to cooperate, but 4 more answers will be explored, or 4 types of power. Fear with Bakuda and Lung, manipulation with Emperor 88, dependence with Coil, and authority with the Wards and New Wave. Is trust also a form of power? What about trust in authority? Is that the same kind of trust as a trust in a teammate? These are important questions. Every day of our lives, these different forces affect our choices, from what career we're going to pursue to what YouTube video we're going to click on. Thanks, by the way. But do these questions have answers? Yes, of course. And we will find these answers with the only method I know. We're going to take the big questions and chop them down into smaller and smaller questions until we find a question that is small enough for us to answer, and answer it. And then we're going to do it again. If it bleeds, my friends, we can kill it. The next point or theme is the shifting of perspectives, particularly how it affects morality. We're going to talk about the interludes, how somebody can seem villainous from Taylor's perspective, while at the same time seeming heroic from their own perspective. In that vein, we'll be taking the first steps in a thesis over how the moral evaluation of a specific action changes the more you know about the world. It's hard to actually count the different themes because in a very real way they all bleed into one another. Madness may seem like a separate theme, but madness is just a perspective that happens to be so extreme that it destroys one's ability to cooperate with other human beings. None of the insane characters we're going to see will have any problem performing technical tasks. It's just that they lose sight of how other people see things. Madness as an inability to interpret reality correctly, again, a problem of information processing, is going to be developed all the way to Kefri. But its roots are already set in this very arc, with Bitch, Labyrinth, and Bakuda. But how does one arrive at madness? The fact that these characters gained madness through intervention of outside forces starts us off with a theme of horror, specifically the horror of being transformed. Betrayal is arguably the cause for the most intense trauma, and the trauma can be seen as a sudden, violent shift in perspective. The subject of shifting perspectives, I think, is the central pillar that supports all of the others. And for that reason, that is where we'll start this analysis. But first, I'd like to expand literally 5 seconds to talk about how amazing this book is. This book is so amazing. I had so much fun writing this essay, you don't even know. But you will. Let's begin! There's this scene in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man that's really good. So Peter Parker's boss at the newspaper, JJ, is a total asshole. He mocks Peter, he's unfair with money, and generally he's just obnoxious. You spend most of the movie thinking that he's just a bad person. And then the Green Goblin breaks into his office looking for the guy who takes all of these pictures of Spider-Man, with the implicit intention to either interrogate or assault him. And I remember watching this as a kid and cringing in my seat because I was absolutely certain that I knew what was going to happen. JJ is going to tell the Goblin how to find Spider-Man. But then, as the Green Goblin is holding him by the neck, he says, "I have no idea who this guy is. His stuff comes in the mail." A sentence so powerful I remember it almost verbatim decades later. As a child, seeing this, I learned something, not just about writing, but about the world. I realized that someone could be seen by me as a horrible person, and if I never saw them in a situation like this, I might never know that they actually have some principles. That they are capable of the most sublime act, according to Billy Blake, to set another before them. I didn't trust JJ, even though he did deserve my trust. I said before that Worm is written from God's POV, but it would be more accurate to say that it shifts into God's POV. It shifts from a not-knowing perspective to an almost all-knowing one, from ignorance to knowledge and back. This is why the interludes are so important. We shift between the ignorant view of people from the outside to the knowing view of their insides. And the interesting part is neither knowing nor not knowing. It is the transition between the states. And because I, like Lisa, am also desperate for people to think that I'm smart, I'm going to use the Greek word anagnorisis, coming out of ignorance. Wildbow's writing is the opposite of formulaic in the common use of the word, but in the literal sense I think it's so formulaic it makes me feel like I'm back at my old job writing lectures for a course in material engineering. So this is how an engineer would try to understand Worm. They would define parameters to work with and then describe these parameters using formula. Let me explain. Let's say that every character or every action has a parameter called villainy. You have an intuitive understanding of what villainy is, and I have one too. But in order to make sure that we are talking about the same thing, we need to define it clearly. So, let's define villainy as how much suffering a person is causing, divided by how much benefit they are getting out of it. If you're not a math person, consider this more natural description. More suffering means more villainy. Less benefit also means more villainy. Now the formula just sits there, but I want to develop an intuition for it, so I'll take some examples and use the formula on them. First example. A person in a situation where they have to kill another person to survive. They can choose whether to kill or to die. For the purpose of this exercise, we assume that dying is bad. Let's say this hypothetical person chooses to kill. The suffering they caused is 1 death. The benefit is 1 life. They're getting a score of roughly 1. That's not very villainous. We can forgive someone who did that pretty easily, even if we wouldn't do that ourselves. Now let's look at the bullies in Taylor's school. They ruin Taylor's every waking moment and probably her sleeping ones as well, pushing her to the brink of suicide and doing extensive long-term damage just because it amuses them. That's a lot of suffering and not a lot of benefit, so they are getting pretty much one of the highest villainous scores I've ever seen for someone who isn't a dictator. A formula for heroism would be the opposite. A hero takes suffering upon themselves to save other people from it. The more suffering you take upon yourselves and the less benefit the other person gains, the more heroic you are. So a person throwing a rope to somebody who's drowning isn't extremely heroic, but a person giving their life to save somebody else is. Taylor, according to this formula, is going to come out as very heroic in this segment, because she's going to suffer for others, though I don't think she's the most heroic character in Worm. These formulas are flawed, but that is intentional. I wanted us to make the same mistake that Taylor does, so that when she realizes her mistake, we can realize our mistake with her. After we do, we can revise our own formula. But for now, let's do what engineers do, which is take rough estimations and develop them into useful tools. So, the impact of an anagnorisis can be defined as the amount of villainy we thought someone had before getting to know them, and how heroic we see them after. Wildbow doesn't immediately try to maximize the impact of an anagnorisis. Instead, he slowly increases it with each interlude, taking on harder and harder challenges with each antagonist, and convinces the reader not necessarily that the antagonist is justified, but that they can be understood. In a way, Worm trains you at shifting perspectives, and by the end of the book we're going to be good enough to get into minds that seem truly evil or mad. In the same way that Worm maximizes villainy, heroism, and anagnorisis, I think Worm maximizes meaning, as in how much meaning you can get from this book, but also in how meaningful moments are. In order to maximize the meaning of Taylor meeting the Undersiders, the scenes that come before make it really clear what it is that Taylor needs, so that the Undersiders can give it to her. We're not going to go over these scenes with the same attention for detail that we did on the last video, not even remotely. We're going to get in quickly, get what we need, and move ahead to talk about philosophy. But in order to see how the argument is constructed, we're going to progress chronologically, even if we omit whole scenes. So buckle in, because the next two scenes are about bullying. This hurts me as much as it hurts you. Probably more, because this is the 10th time I'm going over this text. Hurts so bad, in fact, I feel like I'm going to cry for a whole week. The first occurrence of bullying is as small as it is infuriating. In Gladly's class, everyone is divided into groups and given a simple task: to list the ways that parahumans changed the world since their appearance. The task they were given for the weekend, Taylor busted Lung's balls. This is such a beautiful question. My whole complaint to the superhero genre is that it's opposed to what makes science fiction good. If science fiction asks how society would change if a certain technology came into being, the superhero genre tries to ignore the social consequences of having some people be able to kill others with a thought. Wildbow not only intends to investigate these questions, he declares that these questions exist in this world. Taylor, because she's very smart and we just saw her reading about capes in the bathroom scene, has already come up with a list over the weekend. Greg, Taylor's fellow outcast and unconsenting workmate, is looking it over when one of the bully's friends asks him to let her see. Greg, because he's an average teenage boy, has no idea what's going on around him and is completely surprised when the bullies just take it and ignore his protests. We're going to read about quite a few fates worse than death, and still, these scenes are the worst. The author's life experience really shines here. After the presentation, Gladly commands the bullies on the quality of their work. Taylor's work. This, I think, is what makes it so bad. It's not that the bullies aren't punished. They are commanded for their bullying. Quoting Ecclesiastes, originally Kohelet, "How long will the evil ones rejoice?" After class ends, Mr. Gladly asks Taylor to stay. He tells her that he can see that someone is harassing her, saying that he knows what's going on in his classroom. The contrast here is so stark. He doesn't know what's going on, which is bad enough, but thinking that he knows makes it worse. It makes Taylor feel far more unseen. He urges her to complain about her bullies, saying he can only help if she does. Taylor tries to explain that not only will it not help, but it will be social suicide, giving her bullies an excuse to go even harder on the snitch. Wildbow has strong criticisms to convey over ignorant teachers. Being well-meaning is not enough. Not noticing the consequences of your actions is a crime, and the same crime Taylor is going to find herself guilty of by the end of this arc. This is an attempt by the author to change the world, but for the purpose of the plot, this sets up Taylor's first need, to be seen and understood. Taylor leaves the classroom frustrated right into the next bullying scene, which is, I think, the worst one. The book is relatively easy after this, so let's get it over with. One of the million things I appreciate about this author is how he can make something that could be seen as benign from afar feel so terrible when you're actually in there. Basically, the only thing that happens in this scene is that a big group of girls block Taylor's escape routes and then take turns saying mean words to her. That's not so bad. Taylor herself says that this is pretty low quality as far as insults go, uninspired and self-contradictory. One of the girls calls her a slut and a virgin in quick succession. The data being transferred isn't important. It's the metadata. That these girls choose to say these things signals that they don't care whether or not Taylor is being hurt. They see hurting her as possible, permissible, and pleasurable. This is information that is communicated and proven to her by being communicated. Emma doesn't even join in. She just stays back and enjoys the show. Taylor's loneliness here is, again, maximized. If Taylor was stranded on a lonely island with no one in the world remembering that she ever existed, I think she would have been less lonely than she was there, back to the lockers being bombarded with the message that she is unwanted. When a human being, a highly social animal, gets the message that the people that they are surrounded by enjoy hurting them, they have a strong urge to change that, preferably by going somewhere else. Similarly to how a healthy human being, when accidentally putting their hand on a hot surface, would feel a strong urge to take their hand off said surface. We have a name for that sensation: pain. We also have a name for the act of restraining someone and causing them pain. As Taylor is being tortured, she lists off her options just like she did with Lung: to talk back, to run, and the one I find most important, to physically fight. She pretty rationally comes to the conclusion that if she struck one of her tormentors, she'd be condemned as a psycho, giving her bullies a greater social mandate to do whatever they want to her. She's out of options. Taylor has to just stand there and take it, and she deals with it admirably. Then two things happen. The first is that Mr. Gladly sees her. He sees her helpless and abused, and he shrugs and leaves, as if saying, if you don't complain, that's your problem. Taylor is in shock. She expected nothing, and still she is disappointed. Emma waited exactly for that, for Taylor to be down in order to kick her. She recognizes that this is a good opportunity to strike with the insult that she's been keeping in reserve. She tells Taylor that she looks like she's about to cry for a whole week, like she did when her mom died. Taylor recalls the dialogue they had when they were still friends. Emma told Taylor that she admired how strong she was after her mother's death, and Taylor brushed it off, saying that she cried for a whole week, misunderstanding, as children do, that this is exactly the thing that makes her strong. Wildbow does something really clever here. The moment in which we discover that Taylor's mom died is the same moment in which we see how bad the bullying is. We get these two surprises layered one on top of the other. This structure puts us a little closer to Taylor's mindset. Just like her, we are shocked. We didn't think it was this bad. Throughout Danny's interlude, Wildbow was very careful not to let us know that Danny's ex-wife died, leaving the reason for her absence vague so that this shock could be compounded on with the shock of how horrible Emma is. She doesn't just hurt Taylor horribly, she betrays the trust that Taylor extended to her. This is the first betrayal, but this is also our first information pocket. Both Taylor and Emma know what Emma's done, but if Taylor complained to anyone, she would have nothing to stand on. Some people say that Emma is unrealistically horrible, and I would have agreed if I didn't go through something similar in my own adolescence. I think I was 12 or 13, and I remember the shock when a kid I didn't really know decided to use the worst thing that ever happened to me as raw material to fashion an insult from. And I remember thinking that very moment that he lowered himself more than he lowered me, which is something that's mentioned in Worm as well. It was a cope, of course, but it was still true. A person has to be in a really low place to be so desperate to hurt another human being. So where is Emma? What is she going through? I don't even want to talk about forgiveness, but could there be a perspective that would make this action understandable? Anyway, Taylor bursts into tears and the girls let her go. Her backpack must have fallen off at some point, and when she goes to get it, Sophia steps on it, making it clear that she's not going to let Taylor take it. She doesn't grab it and run, and this is important. She makes Taylor give it up. There's that principle in psychology that I talked about in the True Detective video, that personality is developed through actions. Taylor talked about this herself, about how important it is to keep running every day in order to maintain the habit. I'm going to extend it here to something we're going to call the karmic principle. Karma in Buddhism deals less with the world repaying you for being a good person, and more with how you and the world around you change in response to your actions. Sophia doesn't just try to hurt Taylor. She tries to instill habits in her. She tries to destroy Taylor's personality and transform her into someone who is more likely to give up. So Taylor leaves her bag there, with her lunch and the new book she just bought for Mr. Gladly after the bullies ruined her other one with the juice prank. Gladly failed Taylor in two ways. One was not knowing, and the other one was not defending her when he saw that she needed help. These are the needs with which she joins the Undersiders. Honestly, reading about Taylor's coping mechanisms is worse, in a way, than reading about the abuse itself. Even though she's hungry and she doesn't have enough money to buy lunch, she makes herself focus on the positive. That she's a superhero now, how cool it is, that she actually met supervillains, that she helped to defeat one, that she met a real superhero and he owes her one. She giggles to herself, and for some reason, that's the worst part. We're pretty sure that she inherited her father's rage. Where is it? There's a cute puzzle about how the Undersiders contact Taylor that shows us how Telltale knows things about Taylor, like that she'll look up the Cape forums for mentions of the Undersiders and do it from the public library. She sees Taylor. They all agree to meet without costumes, which is a show of trust. Also, it's just one of the nicest scenes. First time reading, I was so busy focusing on a superhero angle that I didn't really notice that emotionally, this is a lifeline for Taylor. Making new friends that don't know who she is, that aren't a part of her social circle, in which everyone sees her as a punching bag. When she meets the Undersiders, they are just nice to her. When Taylor describes them, she talks about how attractive they are physically. She finds Gru attractive, Regent handsome but too feminine, and Telltale kind of mid, which actually makes Taylor feel more comfortable. People find it strange that so much of the descriptions are dedicated to how people look, but they shouldn't. Taylor isn't being superficial. She learned that physical attractiveness determines who gets to bully and who gets bullied. The fact that Lisa isn't beautiful makes her less threatening, and when she hugs Taylor, even Taylor is aware that she really needed a hug from someone that isn't her father. Did Lisa, aka Tattletale, see that need? The Undersiders take Taylor to the loft, and Bitch, or Rachel, the one that controlled the tiger lizard things, arrive with 3 dogs. The first thing she does is let them loose on Taylor. Taylor is pretty helpless against 3 trained attack dogs, but the attack ends quickly as Brian steps in and punches Rachel in the face. This is so beautiful to me because it tells 2 stories at once. This is the first time we see Brian mimicking some abusive father figure, as he immediately tells Rachel how much he hates that she makes him do this. Makes him be this thing that he hates. But this is an important sentence in Taylor's story, too. After not being protected for so long, Brian steps up for her. How can she not instantly become close to him? There's also a third story here, one about Rachel, about her untrusting, unmitigated aggression and how it forces others to retaliate against her. Rachel sits down to bleed from her nose, neutralized, when something strange happens. Taylor gets up and engages Rachel. She kicks her in the head, ribs, and meow, if I'm reading this correctly. Why is this important? The first thing is the repetition of Taylor again going straight for the genitals. We can take this as a hint about Taylor's libido, striving for some sexual contact, but that doesn't feel right. I think a safer conclusion would be that it signifies something ruthless in her. First time reading this, I thought about how most people, whether they suffered abuse or not, find it hard to attack another person, even when they have to defend themselves. When they aren't being actively attacked, most people find it surprisingly difficult to throw the first punch, to transition from the situation where they aren't fighting into a fight, even if it's the right thing to do. We could assume that a person that never threw a punch would find it harder, and that a person who's used to taking abuse silently would find it harder still. But Taylor just gets up and does it. First time reading this, I thought it was just bad writing, because I didn't trust the author yet. But now that I do trust that the author is trying to communicate something, I asked, what does it tell us about Taylor? What does it tell us about the rage that she inherited from her father? About Sophia's attempt to ruin Taylor's personality? After beating Rachel, Taylor decides to leave. She feels like the whole gang was in on it, and that only becomes worse when Brian uses his power, darkness, to block her escape route. This is the third or fourth time that we've seen Taylor's freedom of movement restricted, and it gets her so angry she just walks into the darkness. But all that Brian needs to do to convince her to stay is just honestly apologize. And he does. There are two very strong motives pulling Taylor back in, though she can't state any of them out loud. The trusting interpretation, confusingly, is that she's going to betray them. Taylor wants to be a hero. She learned from Armsmaster that the heroes don't have a lot of information about the Undersiders, and she wants to give the heroes that information. When the Undersiders extend the trust of meeting her without masks, this is exactly what they're afraid of, that she'll use the information they give willingly in order to hurt them, just like Emma did to her. And you know what? Under the trusting interpretation, Rachel is right to attack her. The distrusting interpretation is that she's just making an excuse so she could hang out with teenagers that aren't horrible to her. The internal conflict here is maximized. The two things that Taylor wants the most, to be a hero and to have friends, are mutually exclusive. This is so extra. If somebody would have told me that there is a rational fake story about this girl joining supervillains who are actually the good guys and having a good time, I would be so on board. Adding this duplicity just makes it so much more interesting. Betrayal is betrayal wherever you see it. That's why it's so important that Taylor is going to either betray the others or herself. These are her only options. Whatever her motives are, she goes back to the loft, and the Undersiders earn her trust by telling her what their powers are. And it turns out that the powers of the Undersiders are all about information. This is a continuation of the theme that we talked about in the last video, information and how it makes fights interesting. I remember thinking that the author gave the Undersiders a strange and lame set of powers, just for it to be weird and counterintuitive. But once we have the key of information, the eclectic powers become extremely cohesive. This thing practically analyzes itself. Grew amidst a sort of darkness that blinds and deafens everyone who's inside of it, except for him. He doesn't even know what it looks like. Lisa's power is a weird one, and I misunderstood it for the entirety of my first read. Let's compare her superpower to Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock has a power of deduction. He gives his power facts as input, and his power outputs back to him accurate deductions, assuming these are logically possible. If you give him wrong data, he may or may not notice that these are wrong, or he may arrive at incorrect conclusions. Lisa's power is a completely different thing. She inputs facts like Gru's power blocks sight, and she gets the fact that his power also blocks all sorts of radiation. This information can't be deduced logically. Unlike Sherlock's power, that's contained within his skull, Lisa's power reaches out to the world somehow and brings the information back to her. If she inputs false information, it will just give her false information in return. Where is the false information coming from? How does the power recognize if the input it's getting is true or false? We don't know, and here we start to feel like the fight over information is between the characters and the powers themselves, which is wonderful. Lisa's power, particularly the fact that it fills in gaps, is a great metaphor for the writing process, because the more story you have figured out, the easier it is to write what's in between. And if you start filling the gap from a false starting point, you're going to end up, like Lisa, with a migraine. Don't believe me about the writing metaphors yet. You will. So already we have a synergy of powers. Gru blocks information. Tattletale discovers it. When Gru and Tattletale combine their powers, they can fight enemies with a stacked information advantage. Used wisely, they can step up against enemies much stronger than they are. Regent's powers seems to be making people's limbs jerk. What does that have to do with information? He makes nerves fire signals. A muscle needs to get a command from a nerve in order to contract, and Regent interferes with that communication. It seems like a shitty power, though Regent's self-chosen nickname, the ruler in the absence of the rightful king, already gives us a hint at what the power is going to become. Regent says his name is Alec, from Alexander the Great, a conqueror, giving us another hint. That's not his true name, though. The true name, Jean-Paul, is a really strange variation on the Hebrew Yonatan Shaul. Two names. The first meaning God gave, and the second meaning something borrowed. A name that reminds us that everything that comes from God will return to God. Rachel's power lets her turn dogs into these huge monsters. Nothing about information here, right? Her power doesn't even let her control the dogs in the same way that Taylor controls bugs. She has to do it the normal way, to actually train them. At first, I thought this was cool and realistic, that she has to do the hard work, but it's much better than that. Rachel's training of her dogs is better than it has any right to be. Just like we didn't know Lung had super hearing as a part of his bundle, Rachel's power gives her knowledge and intuition on how to train her dogs. This seems innocent, but let's phrase it differently. She has intuition on what to do with these sentient creatures, so that even when they're strong enough to kill her with a single paw strike, they still obey her every command. This does not seem terrifying, but it should. If a superpower can give you an intuition on how to gain perfect control over dogs with manipulation alone, is it possible that a power would let someone do the same with human beings? Whatever the powers are, they know how to rearrange human brains and also have knowledge of canine psychology. I wonder how they work. More importantly, Rachel is unable to interpret human social cues. This is the truly terrifying part, and we see, for the first time of many, madness as an inability to understand other people. Rachel comes from the Hebrew Rachel. At first, I didn't find anything that might correlate to what we have here. The only interesting thing that Rachel does in Genesis is name her child an interesting name, Naphtali, which is the direct translation of the name of a book written by an Austrian architecture university reject with a bright talent for public speaking. Further down the same chapter, Rachel's sister, Leah, names her husband's bastard Gad, which is a pun. Gad means luck, but luck arrived, ba-Gad, sounds in biblical Hebrew like he betrayed, bagad. Rachel doesn't have children, but she names her dogs, Brutus, Angelica, and Judas. Not really a clear line there, until we find out that Angelica wasn't named by Rachel, but by a previous owner. She did, however, name Judas and Brutus. What is the connection between the man who betrayed Julius Caesar and the man who betrayed Jesus Christ? This isn't just a literary hint. This is a choice that Rachel took. In the world of the book, Rachel is obsessed with betrayal. Remind me again, what was it on Taylor's mind when she stepped into the loft? This is the kind of attention Worm rewards. I don't think the names are important. I think they're fun to figure out, and that they're a sign from the author to the insane amount of work that's been put into making sure everything fits, an invitation to dig in. The name Brian means noble, a complicated word. In modernity, we use it to mean honorable, magnanimous, like the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. But both in English and in Sanskrit, the word originally meant aristocratic, a noble being someone who is in command of other people. Within this arc, Taylor is going to tell Brian that she thought he was an honorable guy, but she will find out that is not the case. He was just a good commander. LeBron, I feel, is self-explanatory. Lisa comes from Elizabeth, the name of a queen, which puts her above Brian. Elizabeth, from the biblical Elisheva, literally meaning, probably, God is my oath. And, biblically, sister-in-law of Moses, making her pretty much a royal also. Super minor spoiler, but we're going to find out that Lisa has another biblical name, and that one will prove to be more meaningful. And Taylor, what about her power? More than anything else, the impressive and terrifying part of her power has to do with information processing, with knowing where all of her bugs are and feeling some of what they're feeling. That is where we saw her power evolve in this arc, in Taylor's ability to take in information. That too is a parallel, but to what? Witnessing brutality. It was hard to choose which interludes to dig into and which to forgo, in order to finish this analysis before I die of old age. And I chose the one with Amy and Glory Girl because on the surface it's completely unmemorable, but in depth it makes some of the most interesting statements. So, Glory Girl is interrogating a guy, and the interrogation process seems to consist mostly of breaking the man's bones. The formula for villainy produces unintuitive results. She's causing the man a lot of suffering for an unclear gain. It seems like she just enjoys it. The man, however, is a Nazi, so most readers find this palatable and justified. I personally think that the only reason to cause someone suffering is to minimize overall suffering. Hot take, I know. And I don't see that being the case here. There is a lot going on in this scene, mostly natural exposition to New Wave, Coil, the situation with the ABB, and all of it is happening so smoothly that it's hard to notice that every bit of information presented in this scene is important to understanding the rest of the plot. But I would say this scene has three main purposes. The first is a statement in the argument about power and morality. When the Nazi says that what's being done to him is unlawful, The heroine retorts that he's welcome to sue her because her mother is a really good lawyer. The discussion isn't about morality, it's about power. Because her mother is a lawyer, she has more power than he does. The form of power is authority, but it is applied in order to give Glory Girl permission to use pure power, which we're going to define as the ability to cause direct harm. It's surprising that the might is right argument is used by the person who isn't a Nazi. For Glory Girl, the law is just another power. A scene of heroic brutality isn't significantly different from a scene of police brutality. But what makes this scene interesting is that we see it from the eyes of the brutalizer. Monitoring Glory Girl's conscious thought, we see what comes up and what doesn't. The man's suffering just doesn't factor into her equations. Unlike Sophia and Emma, who relish in it, it seems like Gigi just doesn't care. Gigi just doesn't see the Nazi as a human being, which, again, reminds me more of the Nazis than the actual Nazi in this scene. There's a claim being made several times in Worm that because superpowers arrive from trauma, people with superpowers are more likely to be villains, as if the trauma drives them towards violence. But Glory Girl proves the opposite. Because she is a second-generation cape, she had only a minor trigger event, and a pretty cushy life, and still she's as cruel as any villain we're going to see in this arc. She just knows whom she's allowed to apply that cruelty on. The second point is trust. After Gigi breaks one bone too many, she calls Amy to come over and heal the guy, to cover it up, basically. But Amy doesn't want to. There's this reoccurring joke in improv classes that saying, "You always do this," in the middle of a scene is the easiest way to make a scene a part of an ongoing relationship. And Amy does something very similar. She counts the number of times that they've been in that situation, giving you the feeling that this campaign of heroic brutality has been going on for a while. Victoria applies manipulation, hugging Amy and talking about being a family, while the man whose bones she broke whines in the background about how cold he feels. I think it's this rearrangement of the villains as the protagonist and heroes as antagonists that makes people think of The Boys. But the way that Gigi treats her sister is just so familiar and human. It reminds me of pictures of Adolf playing with his dog, looking like a normal, happy dude. This is what monsters look like. The third purpose of this scene is to prepare us for the bank heist, making it even more awesome. We become aware of the fact that Amy's powers can do much more interesting things than healing, and she uses that power to torment a helpless man. Both of these are going to make the bank heist so much more interesting. Without this interlude, the reader would have just been completely blindsided by Amy and Gigi's very existence. Not just by their powers, but by the brutality that they permit themselves to partake in when they think no one is watching. Just like Taylor is going to be in the bank heist. Literature-wise, this is the opposite of what we saw with the crying a whole week scene. Then, we were given less information than Taylor in order for us to be in the same mindset as her, shocked. Here, we are given more information than Taylor, and by the time the heist falls apart, the reader will be separated from Taylor. She will be surprised, but we will know of Amy and her powers, as well as Glory Girl's fondness for breaking bones when no one is looking. This surprise is great for putting Taylor on the spot, but pretty bad for the reader to come from nowhere, so the author separates them. This is pretty brilliant. Also, a double quick name check. Victoria is obvious, but Amy comes from Amelia, meaning both hardworking and rival, which is pretty great in this context. She doesn't have a choice but to work all of the time because of her healing powers, and also she's one of the most hated characters in the book, for me at least. More objectively, the fact that she's a hero who lived a safe life yet punches and looks down on villains without understanding them makes her an enemy, not just of Lisa and Taylor, but of the point this book is trying to make, that we should not overlook anyone's suffering. The gang robs a bank. The Undersiders get an offer from their mysterious boss to do a bank heist. The boss offers to give them $2 for every dollar they take from the bank. So when we try to estimate the villainy of this action, we get the relatively low score of a third. For each dollar the bank loses, the Undersiders gain 3, and the insurance company pays for it anyway. The fact that the shareholders of the insurance company are going to see no significant change in their quality of life, coupled with the fact that the Undersiders will move from being poor to being filthy rich, is pretty important. And the boss gives them that money willingly. Taking all of that into account, robbing the bank is an almost neutral action, morally speaking. But what about the risk to human life that comes with any robbery? Well, Taylor tells herself that she will make the Undersiders less likely to hurt anyone if she's there, and they're going to do the heist with or without her, so it's all for the better, right? Taylor goes to tell Armsmaster that she wants to keep spying on the Undersiders in order to find out who their boss is. Again, unlike the villains that were nice and generous with her, that respect her, Armsmaster communicates to Taylor very clearly that whenever he decides, he can use his mandate from the state to inflict suffering on her. He doesn't threaten violence, of course, only that he will take her to jail, where she will be held against her will and, wait a second, that is violence. In general, Armsmaster reminded me of what it feels like talking to TSA agents as a Middle Eastern man with a beard. But unlike the TSA agents, Armsmaster is reasonable. He's an asshole, but he tells Taylor that her plan is insane and that she should give it up and just join the program for young superheroes, the Wards. The fact that you don't like him makes what he's saying hard to accept. This is something that we're going to see a lot. The emotions that we as readers develop towards certain characters make a huge difference in how we take their arguments. This is one of the biggest takeaways from the book. People that you hate might actually have good arguments that you should listen to. The other side of the coin is that people who don't trust you are hard to reach with arguments, no matter how good said arguments are. Taylor rejects the idea of joining the Wards, explaining to herself that it's going to be just like high school. This seems stupid, but it isn't. I mean, she's making the wrong decision, but that's what happens when you get repeatedly traumatized for years and no one helps. You lose trust in the systems that are supposed to protect you. I quote Oranges and Blake and the Bible because I think the author meant for them to be a part of Worm, and I often quote pop culture because it's familiar and refreshing. But when I quote a poet that does not fall into these categories, I'm doing so in order to make a point that I have no other way of making. I'm using poetry as a medium to say something that I wouldn't otherwise know how. That's why I think reading poetry is important, because it gives you a pool of ideas to draw from. There's a poem by Itzhak Tebenkin that I never really understood until I started writing this essay. Translated very literally, it goes like this. When the path of a person betrays them, their own legs will lead them astray, to a place that no one desires, that has not a branch to gather, no bread, no fire, no water, that has but fistfuls of ash. This is a very Old Testament poem. What does it mean when the path of a person betrays them? Remember Job and Isaac? Job follows the commandments. He donates 1/10 of his field to the poor, he works hard, prays hard, and still God makes him bury his own children for no reason. Job keeps following the commandments, and at the end God gives him more kids than he had before, which in a biblical story is considered a happy ending. Isaac stays in Canaan during the famine, which means not just being hungry, but weathering the danger of somebody killing you for your food. And God similarly rewards him with reproductive success. And then people tell me that the Bible and evolution are at odds. Taylor had been a good kid. She studied, she was nice to everybody, she had been sticking to the path, and still things went to shit. In the bathroom scene, I called her an idiot for saying occupied when the bullies knocked on the door, but she wasn't. That's just what you do when someone knocks on the door of the bathroom stall you're in. And what did she get for it? Taylor's path of lawfulness has betrayed her. Taylor doesn't go carry on the school, but she doesn't stick to the path either. She keeps trying to do good, but she abandons the rules. She's going to join a bunch of supervillains and rob banks, which is illegal, I think, but she's going to keep doing it for good reasons. Before Leviathan, Taylor's own feet will carry her to a place where nobody wants to be. It is going to be a beautiful journey, though, and like any journey, the most important part is the friends we've made along the way. And what makes a friendship strong? Trust. And how do we make people trust each other? We put them through the crucible together, as Walbo does in the bank heist. I'm not going to get into the tactics of this scene. A lot of people analyzed this before me, and my ability to provide new insights is dependent on my choice to work where I have the advantage, just like the Undersiders do. In my case, that's symbolism and themes. However, there are 2 tactical moments in this cape fight that not only make it amazing, but make every other cape fight worse for not having them. One is when we realize that, I guess I'm too lazy to look this up, and Clockblocker switched costumes. It's unclear why they did this for the first time and never do it again, but it doesn't matter. You are left to wonder why the Avengers are making it easier on their opponents to know who is whom. The second is the moment that Lisa pulls a gun. There is a quick succession of emotions there. The first is surprise, and the second is something like, of course, of course. Why wouldn't she pull a gun? Think about that the next time you are watching Beast from X-Men get into a fight and just accept that someone is out of his range. I was slightly more prepared for this moment because I read something very similar in Harry Potter and the Method of Rationality. Two wizards are stuck in some magical deadlock when one of them just pulls out an Uzi, making you wonder why none of the other wizards ever picked up that low-hanging tactical advantage. Uzi, by the way, comes from the Hebrew Uziel, meaning God is my courage. Coincidence? Yes. Let's go over the bank scene a little more linearly. So, the Undersiders get into the bank. They use Taylor's power to hold all of the prisoners at Spider Point. The wards arrive. They represent and demonstrate the power of authority. Authority has a lot of advantages. They get funding and support. They can go out in daylight. What's the disadvantage of authority as power? Well, first of all, they have to attend this fight whether they want to or not as protectors of the people. Secondly, they can't play dirty, at least not while they are seen. Taylor doesn't know yet that Amy is in the house, but she feels that she's being attacked. Amy uses her power to make a bug that she's touching send Taylor wrong signals, making her basically unable to use her power. The attack is, of course, information-based, just like Amy's most important tactical maneuver, sending a text to Glory Girl, who crashes the party soon after. What makes this fight so terrifying isn't how strong Gigi is. It's that Lisa and Taylor are alone with her, and no one will witness what Glory Girl will do to them. Again, an information pocket. Amy will witness the violence, of course, but we know that she'll cover up her sister's acts of brutality. This is because the sisters have trust. And so, as soon as Telltale arrives, she attacks that trust. While Taylor holds Amy at knife point, Telltale uses her insight to instruct her on how to neutralize Amy's information attack, all the while reading information off the heroes. She promptly announces her findings, 2 secrets that if she spoke aloud would ruin the relationship between the sisters. When it becomes clear to the sisters that this is something that Telltale can actually do, Amy forces Taylor to let go by running into the knife, and Taylor pulls the knife away. She has to because of the power of authority. If Taylor kills Amy, she's going to become public enemy number 1 and either be killed or sent to a prison that you can never escape from. If Gigi gravely wounds one of the villains, well, either Amy will cover for her or Gigi will get chewed off by her parents. She's been chewed off before. Now that the villains no longer have a hostage, Gigi grabs Telltale and throws her like a rag doll. A deliberate word chosen to signify that she doesn't see the villain as a human being. Maybe. Even though she's almost paralyzed with pain, Telltale tells Taylor to send bugs on Glory Girl. Taylor refuses because Gigi is invincible, and the bugs won't work on her. Well, that's not true. Taylor refuses because she doesn't trust Telltale yet. She doesn't trust her abilities. Taylor is also under an attack from Glory Girl, an information attack. Glory Girl wants everyone to think that she's invincible. Using a gun here isn't just about making the fic rational. It's the fact that Telltale figured out Glory Girl's force field, and how shooting at it will make it restart, letting Taylor's bugs in. This is where we start to understand why Telltale is the queen of the Undersiders. She has the power to do to near strangers the same thing that Emma did to Taylor, to turn someone's most shameful piece of trivia against them. The parallel is so tight that the attack is directed specifically to Amy's familial relationship, in this case, her father. Isn't that strange how eagerly Taylor runs to Lisa's arms? Speaking of recreating trauma, there's another super important moment here. When Taylor fights Clockblocker, she covers him with bugs. First time I read this, I saw this mainly as good tactics, but reading it with an eye for trauma, we see what Taylor is doing here. First of all, she puts Clockblocker in a very similar situation to the one that she was in the locker, covered in bugs. She says that everybody's been covered by bugs at some point, but like, have they? It's easy to forget how gross bugs are in large numbers. I'm not particularly grossed out by bugs, but imagining bugs prying my eyes open and getting under my eyelids is really uncomfortable. And that's what Clockblocker is going through. I would argue that it's worse than having maggots crawl over your skin. That Taylor not only replicates her trauma, she's augmenting it. But the replication is twofold, even threefold. She also makes him hate and be grossed out by her. She's making herself into a freak in his eyes. While adding the third layer, getting herself trapped, confined to a space where people outside are trying to hem her in and hurt her. Just like with the locker, the bathroom, and the rooftop with Lung. It would kill the flow of this essay to list every character that has some interaction with their own Jungian shadow here, but one thing really stood out to me. Regent, or Alec the Great, takes hold of Kidwin's laser cannon and uses it to blast the Tinker's friends. Later, he gets hold of the flying skateboard and really wants to take it home with him. Alec is usually indifferent, so it's strange to see him actually upset when Gru doesn't let him take control over something that belongs to someone else. He's more than just willing to take and use what belongs to another person. With him, it feels like a need. We don't know what his power is yet, not fully, and we will only find out about his trauma relatively late in this arc. He was used by his father as a tool. His liberty, his self, was taken away from him to serve the purpose of someone else. And the only thing we see him passionate about is taking from others what's rightfully theirs. The Undersiders escape with the money, relatively safe and happy. After the bank heist, the heroes consider what supervillain name they'd give Taylor. They first of all consider a worm, a humiliating name. That's basically high school bullying via newspapers and authorities, but it also parallels the namings that the Babylonian kings subjected the Judean kings to. There is power in naming someone. The only reason they don't do it is because it would make them look bad. Because she already beat them, so they choose Skitter, which I still find kind of annoying. Bitch, similarly, is always referred to as Hellhound, which pisses her off for similar reasons. This isn't the first time that we go, hey, is this why the book is called Worm? Or maybe the second after we learn about Taylor's powers. There are many reasons this book is called Worm, and I think the truest, or at the very least the most convincing reason, is in Oranges, specifically in a quote of Blake that is made in Oranges. It won't make sense until we reach the ending, though, so for now, I ask that you trust me on this. Fake origin stories. Trust is often built by saving each other, by being there for one another in times of need, like friends indeed. And that's why I think it's so hard to build strong relationships in a world where there's very little you actually need from other people. That's why we rely on other ways of building trust, being vulnerable with one another and knowing one another well. But Taylor goes into superhero fights with her friends. They escape together by the skin of their teeth, and she actually trusts them, even when they take off their costumes and change their names. Taylor is on top of the world with her new friends, getting hugs and clothes from Lisa, handsome smiles from Brian, and friendly insults from Alec. She needed this. Quoting Blake again, the bird a nest, the spider a web, man friendship. But because Wildbow can't just let us enjoy ourselves, there's always the tension from the fact that she's planning to betray them. No, wait, that's not true. Wildbow doesn't just want you to suffer. He's making a parallel to the experience of trying to make friends for the first time after going through extensive isolating trauma. Although the reason is different, Taylor lets you experience the feeling that there is something inside of you that you have to hide from your friends. Something that if they found out about, they wouldn't want to be your friends anymore. There's an interesting mix here between allegorical and superficial, because Taylor actually tells the Undersiders about her trauma. As they're sitting down at Fugly Bob's Burgers, Taylor asks the Undersiders about how they got their powers. Nobody wants to say anything because, as they explain to Taylor, a trigger event is the worst moment of your life. Taylor says that she hopes she can call them friends, and Lisa says she'll slap her in the face if she finishes that sentence, which is so sweet, but at the same time there's that nagging suspicion. Does Lisa know about Taylor's upcoming betrayal? On the one hand, we see no sign that she does, but we're only seeing Taylor's perspective, and we know that when Taylor was lying to Danny, she was completely oblivious to the fact that he was seeing through her bullshit. Anyway, Taylor tells the Undersiders about the locker. She tells them about how helpless she was and is, knowing that they might see her as lesser. That is a brave thing to do, even for someone who didn't have exactly this kind of confession used against them. And yet, there's not much of a response. There's no catharsis to it. They don't cry with her, they don't get angry, they don't exactly comfort her either. Alec is less outraged than he was about leaving Kidwin's hoverboard behind. He simply asks, why is she not poisoning the bullies to death? Her answer makes sense to me. It is an answer that has to do with karma. If she starts using her powers against them, even for some harmless trolling, it will become a habit, and it will escalate.
Post-edit note. I can't believe I'm almost done editing this video and I'm only figuring it out now. The reason she doesn't hurt the bullies isn't tactical and it isn't karmatic. It's too naive for her to say out loud, even to herself. It's because it causes suffering without bringing any benefit to anyone but herself. Making bugs put laxatives in Emma's hot cocoa is going to be a strictly villainous act with a zero heroic value, so Taylor, who wants to be a hero, just doesn't do it.
The Undersiders, though, don't really understand what Taylor is talking about. There is a loneliness to being a part of this group. The Undersiders don't complain to one another. They don't hug unless they're happy. Lisa never says, when Glory Girl dislocated my shoulder, that really hurt, and it was also super scary. God, I was so scared. And the Undersiders never hold her as she cries. Not that she even cries. Instead, Lisa says, hey G-Man, pop my shoulder back into place, and Gru does, and that is it. None of the Undersiders ask another, hey, are you okay? How are you holding up as a teenager in this extremely high-stress environment? An important part of being someone's friend is the simple act of feeling what they are feeling, being sad when they are sad or angry when they are angry, and it seems like the Undersiders don't have that at all. It seems like they don't care, but that's not it. They're afraid of showing weakness, of being vulnerable. If you've had friends who grew up in dysfunctional environments, you might be familiar with that surprise when you find out that they care much more than you thought, but can't show it without feeling compromised. Worm lets us practice noticing that on Brian. So this is the kind of situation that Brian is in this scene. He realizes that nobody but Taylor wants to share their own story, which puts Brian in a conflict between his two sole motivations. The one is to protect his friends, in this case to protect Taylor from the embarrassment of being the only one to tell a personal story. The second is not to show any weakness. He resolves this conflict by lying, by basically making a story up. There is a Reddit post by Wildbow himself about the epistemological status of this story, but I simply don't care. When I talk about the book, I talk about the imaginary experience I'm having when my eyes meet the written symbols. Or more accurately, the sum of all likely experiences of people reading this book. And Wildbow's interpretation of the text is not a part of that experience. What I do experience in this scene is a lot of hints that Brian is lying. One thing that stood out is that he saw the darkness coming out of his wounds, even though he told us before that he can't see his own darkness. The second is that any other trigger event that we're going to see is going to involve extreme emotional distress, and his doesn't. Again, the author screws the reader over by giving them the information and only later giving them the keys to decrypt it. We also have softer clues, like the fact that Brian edited his own wiki page to give false information, and that his power, more than anything, is about not being seen. Being seen by others is a basic human fear. When someone stares at you, it makes you uncomfortable, and for good reason. When someone gathers information on you through observation, it makes them likelier to beat you in a fight. Collecting information is in itself a form of aggression. This is something that even gorillas and dogs are aware of. What does that have to do with Brian becoming Gru? So the story goes like this. Brian and his little sister Aisha were separated when their parents divorced, and they slowly lost touch because they had nothing in common. One day, Aisha sends Brian a text simply saying, "Help me." He goes over as quickly as he possibly can, not knowing why. Imagine this with me for a second. Imagine that you're Brian and you get this text and you just know that something really bad happened. So you take a cab and you leave the taxi driver behind you screaming for his money, and you run for the house and you see your little sister crying. You ask her what happened and she doesn't answer. Just like you, she doesn't want to be exposed. A man that you may or may not recognize approaches, and you instantly realize that this is the man who attacked your helpless little sister. And that person is looking at you, sizing you up. When you're a martial artist, there is a moment when you are faced with a stronger opponent that you simply have to fight. There is a fear that has to do with how small and weak you are. Specifically the fear of somebody seeing it. And Gru hides it. He wishes with all of his being for this person not to see how weak he is, and again, his prayers are heard. It doesn't hurt that it's much easier to beat the shit out of somebody who can't see you. Brian's fear, Brian's trauma, is being too late to protect Aisha, is the fear of not being able to stop what has already happened to her from continuing, the fear of being too weak and the fear of being seen as such. I can only assume how much hearing Taylor's story, particularly the fact that it's ongoing, triggers him. We're seeing from Gru a lot of signs that he grew up with an extremely dominant male parent. From the way he forgets to ask other people whether they agree to his plans, or how he hates when bitch makes him beat her. Even the way he gets on Alex's case that he should practice hand-to-hand combat, just like his father allegedly made him practice boxing, is a replication of such behavior. In a segment I simply don't have time to cover in this essay, the caseworker that's supposed to approve of Aisha moving in with Brian says that he made the apartment his own, not giving Aisha room to express herself. Quoting Jared Carmichael, "Exactly what you run from, you end up chasing." Note, Aisha, from Old Arabic meaning lively or womanly, is the name of the third wife of the Prophet Muhammad. Up until recently, the consensus was that she married the Prophet at the age of 9, though modern academics suggest she was in fact 19. We can only guess what motivated this new analysis, but either way I don't think Aisha married the Prophet out of love, and we can only imagine how difficult it was to share a bed with a grown man that she did not choose. She did, however, end up being a scholar and is known in Sunni tradition for her intelligence and inquisitiveness, which shows me how little I know about Islam. In Worm, Aisha is going to be an absolute pain in the ass for Brian, but the book encourages us to remember she was attacked by a domineering man with whom she was forced to live. We can cut her some slack. So now, we have a grasp on the trauma that Brian's reliving every time he smacks somebody in the face, every time he tries to protect Taylor and fails miserably, like he's just about to do with Bakuda. At the same time, it's in the fight with Bakuda that we get to see how much he cares. We'll get to that in the next video. Let's wrap this up. Worm is not a book about trauma. It is the book about trauma. True Detective, for example, is a great show, and it deals with trauma, even with the replication of it. Errol has been tortured, so he tortures. Rust failed to protect, and he forces himself to look at all of those other victims that he failed to protect. Each one recreates their trauma in one way, maybe one and a half. This is simplistic compared to Worm and the way its 5 protagonists each show 2 different ways of replication. Worm encouraged me to go to therapy. I didn't want to go. From a utilitarian standpoint, it didn't make sense to me. Why should I go back and look at these painful moments when I'm doing fine, all things considered? And the reason to go through it, as Worm makes it easier to see, is that the trauma isn't hidden, it's at the forefront. Our friends can see it in our behavior, even if they don't know what it is that they are seeing. And we can see it in our own thought processes, even if we don't recognize the processes for what they are. This is why imp is going to be such an important metaphor for the ability of our own mind to hide things from us. When you deal with trauma, it doesn't feel like old forgotten memories resurfacing. It feels like recontextualizing the things you see and do every day. Quoting St. Anthony, I guess, "You know the demons that plot against you. Fear them not." The only thing that's incomplete about Wildbow's menagerie of trauma is that all of the characters cope outwards. They retaliate against the world. In our lives, we are more likely to encounter the opposite reaction of withdrawing into oneself, something that's often overlooked in literature because nobody wants to read about a knight who's back from the Crusades and now hyperventilates every time he hears the clinging of metal on metal. Well, that's not accurate. I want to read about this stuff. That's why I wrote a story about a biblical warlord or judge that despite his godly powers is helpless to deal with a condition that biblical Hebrew didn't have a name for. And now that I think about it, his attempts to alleviate the symptoms also end up replicating the initial trauma. Huh. You can download an ebook version in the description, but I warned you that I wrote it in biblical English because my trauma was similar to Lisa's, and now I have this dire need to show everybody how smart I am. I kid, but seriously, once you learn to see the replication of trauma, it's everywhere. Those who have been isolated isolate themselves. Those who have been ridiculed try so hard not to leave any opening that they become a caricature. Those who have been diminished look for those who diminish them. Those who have been antagonized antagonize. When the demon Mara shot arrows at the Buddha, the enlightened one transformed them into flowers by the simple act of observing them for what they were. And we can do that too. Therapy is one way to do it. Psychedelics are much cheaper, though I will never encourage you to do something so illegal and dangerous. Sure helped me though. At my worst, my coping was made mainly of a combination of Lisa and Taylor's approaches, with occasional doses of Brian, Alec, and Rachel, which I regret the most. With help, I've let go of the latter 3, and now rely less on the former 2. But as you are now listening to a text that I rewrote 10 times and recorded 3 times in a language that I still feel like I'm only pretending to know, healing isn't about becoming someone else. It's about using those skills that you developed to do something you can genuinely enjoy, and that other people can hopefully enjoy as well. If you did enjoy this video, or dare I hope found it useful, consider sharing it with the person who recommended Worm to you, or anyone else you think might enjoy it as well. Thank you for watching is such a small sentence. When I was a child, I dreamed of being a university professor, to use science in order to discover useful things and then communicate these discoveries to people who are actually interested in them. That dream died the first time I stepped into a lecture hall, and yet here I am doing exactly that. This is an absolute privilege. Thank you to all of my beta viewers, especially the new one who helped me make this video gooder. The next video is going to come out in a week or so, followed shortly by another one. Until next time, you turn those arrows into flowers, you hear?